Right. Okay. Sorry. So moving on then. So in reference to this, of course, as I mentioned, here are our groups. We add our users and define them here. And of course, as I was mentioning, the roles in terms of responsibility, the highest should always appear at the top here. Now, moving on, again, creating these roles will define the functionality or allowed you to specify particular users who should have responsibilities. But at this time, all we have done is create those roles. Nothing else is in regards to that. So what we can see, however, is on the right here or above on these separate tabs, we can see there are different options. And the next one we want to focus on is simply put the rights. Now, what we'll see is, of course, with the roles that we have created, they will now appear. So of course we can see our admin role, we can see our support desk, and we can see all users. But also you will be able to see that we have two unique project roles that I haven't created. We have the submitter of tickets and the ticket handler. Now these are hard-coded project roles and they will exist in every form that you create. Even if you don't plan on using them, they will always exist, okay? And there's a very good reason for that, which we'll explain in a second. You will find in almost all cases, the submitter of ticket is a very, very valuable and useful feature, a project role that should be used in a lot of circumstances. And the ticket handler still certainly does have its use, but it's not as frequently used. I would say in 99% of your forms, you will most likely be relying on the submitter of ticket in some way. And then in maybe 50, 40%, the ticket handler can find some use. However, we'll explain those in a bit more detail in just one second. For now, we're going to focus on, of course, the project roles that we have created and the permissions beneath them, allowing us to define what this role can do. So we can see here, of course, that there are a variety of options. The first one, of course, being view tickets. This is going to allow the users to, simply put, view any submissions that they have made and allow them to, well, yeah, view tickets, as it says, really. We then have update tickets. This is going to allow us to make changes or edit any submissions that have been made. Submit tickets is a permission which will allow us to submit those tickets as well. So this will allow us to, from the very front end of the system, it will show the Infocapture form from this list, and we will then be able to submit a ticket when we click on that form. Handle tickets. So handle tickets is in reference to the assigned fields. So if we recall in our last webinar, we were looking at the edit project properties, and there was a section here called the assigned field appears. And with this ticked, it will mean that if we utilize something like the support tickets, just to give a bit of clarity, at the very bottom of your form, you will see this assigned to field. Now this will only appear with that option selected, and in order to determine who is going to appear in the assigned to field, is referenced by this handle tickets option. So for instance, if we were to give the support desk that option, it means anyone in that support desk group would then appear in the assigned to field, allowing you to select any of those users and assign them specifically for that particular issue. Update ticket status, of course, is what you would call, I suppose, the additional feature there, which our handle ticket is in reference to the assigned to field. And the status, or the update ticket status, is in reference to the status option here. So if you have that permission, it will allow you to move the form through the workflows. As we'll see later on in this call, it isn't all just purely defined by this update ticket status permission. When you are creating a workflow, you can give unique permissions at that time as well to specify whether or not you're allowed to move it to certain statuses or at certain times within the workflow of the form. But this is the general functionality that if you don't have this permission, the workflow further will not allow you to make those configurations. Assign tickets is obviously the opposite of handle tickets, where handle tickets means your name will appear in the list. Assign tickets means you have the control to select people from said list. So my name isn't in there, so I don't have handle tickets, for instance, but I do have the assign to ticket permission, meaning I can select whomever I want. Next, we have our view notes and add notes to tickets. These work, of course, realistically together. And what they simply allow you to do is when we're looking at a form that's been submitted, we'll notice there's a couple of options up at the top. One of these being notes. And this is a very powerful feature within Infocapture. It simply allows you to have a discussion and an open dialogue with other users, or maybe someone submitted a ticket and they weren't necessarily clear with what they were saying. You can then follow up with that using this notes function and have that dialogue still localized within the ticket that was submitted, and not having to go to like an email to have that communication or anything along those lines. It stores that nicely within the ticket there. Now you can, of course, have, as we can see here, the permission to view those notes and the permission to add notes yourself. This will, of course, either allow you simply just to see this information, or as we can see here, type in information of our own and have that filled out. Next, we have our view attached files and attach files to tickets. Very similar. This is going to allow you from here, as you can see, the file upload option will allow us to attach any sort of documents or attachments to this. And then, of course, having the view option allows us to see those as well. Next, we have the view history of tickets. And this is going to allow us to see both the history and history diagram sections up at the top of our form, where we can see, of course, the timeline of what changes have been made, maybe status updates, or if notes have been added, as we can see, similar things like this. And the history diagram, which is more of a visual indicator of the workflow that's occurred within this particular submission. So again, this is only for this particular ticket, but we can see, of course, when it was submitted, if any SLAs, which is something we'll cover in future sessions, have occurred, and basically who has done these changes and at what times. Manage tickets means, of course, that you can delete the form, delete any files or notes on there as well. And the view reports page and view statistics pages allow us to, of course, simply do that to either view any sort of reports or statistics revolving around Infocapture there. So with that said, and a brief explanation of each of these, we'll look at the reports and statistics in, again, a later version of these webinars. So I won't go into too much depth right now, but simply put, as it says, it will allow you to view those pages. So with that sort of defined and a brief understanding of these, we're going to now specify each of our project roles to have certain permissions. So again, admin, we'll say, can do everything. Our support desk, let's say they can view, they can update, they can submit, they'll be handlers. And in fact, actually, maybe we'll take admin out of the handle one. We'll update ticket status, that's fine. Assign tickets, view notes, add notes, files. Potentially view the history, but let's say they can't manage or view any of the reports or statistics. And then all users, let's say that they can view, they can update, they can submit, maybe they can update the ticket status, they can view notes, add notes, maybe attach files, etc. Okay, and then of course they can't view history, they can't manage anything. So you might look at this and you might think that this looks like a healthy structure in terms of what permissions you would like to give each of these roles. Again, admin having a lot more control, support having some control, but being still a bit more restrictive when it comes to the reports and information like that. And then all users having certain permissions here as well, but we don't want them to be able to sort of interact with some of the features. Now, this might look okay, but what we're really saying here, and this is a big issue. Apologies, sorry. Tim has asked a question here before I continue. Does the attached files to a ticket impact the ability to upload a file when filling out a form, or only after the form is submitted? That's a very good question, Tim. So it's very interesting how you would mention that. So of course, on the form that we've created, if we go back to view that very quickly and view the form here. So if we recall, naturally, we created 2 file upload fields in this. Now, it's worth mentioning that these items here are not controlled by that permission from the project roles. So you can always upload files here, regardless of if you've got the upload file permission within the permission section here. So even if you don't have attached files to a ticket, you'll still be able to utilize these. So as you said, this is a different file functionality, and this will appear, of course, after submitting a ticket. However, when you are submitting a ticket for the first time, in sort of regards to utilizing that functionality as well, we'll also notice at the very bottom, there's this add file section. Now, this is different to the ones that we've got on our forms, you can see here. And this is, again, the permission controlled one. So if you have that permission to attach files to tickets, this will appear at the bottom of your form. And it is separate, of course, to the fields that you can actually add to the form directly. It's a way of sort of allowing people to add files at the start of the form, at the very beginning of the form, but not allowing people to continue to add attachments that the permission would allow. So that's the difference between these two. But yes, if you have that permission, you can add files at the very beginning before you've even submitted the form and continuing on afterwards. Alternatively, if you don't have that permission, but you have this function, you can attach a file while filling out the form, but you can no longer do it later on. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. Brilliant. Okay. So yes, so as I was mentioning here, these permissions, fantastic. So Trey has asked a wonderful question, which is perfectly what we're setting up for now. And it's which permission should be set to make certain that the submitters can only view the tickets that they submitted and not all tickets, which is exactly what I was going to bring up, because at this moment in time, what the view ticket permission is referring to is that you can view every single ticket, okay? So regardless, as you said, if you are the one who've submitted that or filled out that particular request or ticket, you will be able to see everyone else's. And of course, from a depending on the nature of the form, that might be okay, but you know, from the majority of forms that users will be creating or you guys will be creating, that might be a bit of a HR nightmare if people can see other people's submissions, especially if it's like a return to work or something like that. It's going to make things a little bit awkward. So because of that, although this might look like an appropriate sort of permission structure, it certainly isn't, because again, as we mentioned, this means that anyone can, because all users consists of the all registered group, it means that everyone can see every submission. They can make changes to every submission. They can submit tickets, that's fine, but they can update the ticket status on any form. They can do all of these things because they have full control here, purely because they have mostly these 2 permissions, which is naturally something we want to avoid. So that's where this project role, most importantly, the submitter of ticket, comes into play. Because realistically, what we would most likely do is in fact dial this down, and we would take those away from all users, take these away, like so, okay? And leaving the all users role with simply submit tickets. What this will allow them to do is from the front end, as I mentioned before, when we're looking at the form, from Infocapture here, they'll be able to see this, they'll be able to click on the particular form, and they'll be able to hit this submit ticket button, okay? And now by doing that, they'll then be able to fill out the form, put all the information they need in, and then they'll hit submit. Then what will happen is after submitting that particular ticket that they filled out, they will then become the submitter of that specific ticket, okay? And that means that they will then become this project role. So they will no longer reside in all users. They will, although technically they will, but of course, because no other permissions are there, it will move over to their responsibility being part of the submitter of ticket, as this is actually a higher authority than even the admin role would allow, and ticket handler even higher than that. But this will then allow you to move over to this sort of configuration, at which point we can then say, if you have submitted or if you are the submitter of a ticket, you can view that ticket or those tickets that you've submitted and nothing else. Likewise, you can update. And that means, again, you can only update the ones that you have submitted. Let's say you can update the status. You can view the notes. You can add notes. You can view attached files, and you can attach files at this point. So even with this functionality, it's worth mentioning that what this would allow you to do is not have that sort of file upload at the bottom of the form as we were discussing a second ago, but afterwards you can attach files and everything like that. In fact, let's get rid of that because it might be a bit confusing. And let's just say that they can view attached files. But there we go. So what we're doing with this is we're defining that not all users will be able to see every single submission, only the ones that they have submitted. Does that make sense there, Trey? Brilliant. So following on from that, just to quickly clarify, the other sort of permission here, of course, as I mentioned, is the ticket handler. So hopefully we can see the importance of the submitter of ticket and how you will almost always want to set this up for every form that you create. Now, the ticket handler is of a similar fashion, but instead of it being based on the tickets that you have submitted yourself, it's based on the tickets that you are assigned. So again, if we were to go back to our support tickets, just as an example, because it's got a bit of content on here. And as we saw before with this part that says assign to, whoever you select in this assign to field becomes the ticket handler. Okay, so again, that means that you might not want, in a circumstance or in a situation like this, you might not want the support team or the support desk seeing every single submission that comes through. You only want them to be responsible and see the ones that they have been assigned. So again, you could further dial these permissions back, still let them submit their own potentially, but let's do something like this. And because we're giving them the handle tickets permission as well, it means, of course, that their name will appear in this drop-down box on the assign to. And then when we select the appropriate one, they will then become the ticket handler. And then anything that they are assigned, they will, of course, then be able to view, they'll be able to update, they'll be able to move the status, assign the ticket to someone else, view notes, add notes, view attached files, etc. So that's where the ticket handler comes into play. It's worth mentioning that as soon as you have, for instance, they could assign tickets to someone else, as soon as they are no longer populated in that assigned to box and it's been moved to another user, they would no longer become the ticket handler, and the new person would have those responsibilities, and they would revert back to whatever project role they were here and the permissions that that would give them. So this still has a lot of use and can be certainly effective in a lot of forms that you create. But as you can probably see from that, it's not always as important. You don't necessarily need to use the assign to function in all of your forms. And even then, you might not necessarily need to be very restrictive with only the assigned to people having a bit more control than the group of people that can normally be assigned, if that makes sense. It still does have its uses, as I said. It's just slightly more niche than the submitter of ticket, which again is something you should probably be using very frequently. So I'm just going to remove the ticket handler in this case and just go back to giving the support desk pretty much all the permissions here. There we go. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm just going to hit save quickly now. So that's updated those permissions. It's defined those project roles. Everything's great there. Are there any other questions at this point? Is that all making sense to everyone? Okay. I'll wait for any questions, or I'll keep an eye out for any questions, but perfect. So before we continue with the other parts of today's webinar, I just want to show you, of course, that there are a couple of other items here. Well, one being all, which just includes all of it into one section like so. But the other item here is options. And this allows you to have some additional functionality within the rights there. So you can see here that there's a couple of items on here. The first one is to enable private notes and files. And the second option here is, if you're planning to utilize that, to have those private notes and files be set as default when it comes to sort of creating these. So what this will allow you to do is if I choose to enable private notes and hit save, we'll now go back to the rights and we'll see that an additional permission has appeared up at the very bottom here, basically saying that private notes can be utilized by this project role if we choose to select it. So as an example, what we could do is we could say that both the admin and the support desk can view private notes, but the submitter, for instance, couldn't. And this will simply mean that although, of course, the submitter has the permission to see normal notes and allow for that discussion, the private notes section will allow other people within the same project role or project roles who tend to work side by side to communicate with each other just to clarify or search for a bit more information without letting the submitter know realistically. You know, for instance, we can see that if I look at this again and go to the notes section here, there's this option to turn this into a private note, at which point anyone with that private note permission would be able to see that, and anyone who can see normal notes but not the private notes will not be able to see this. It will just be completely invisible to them. This can be very useful, as I said, for sharing maybe technical information between developers in our case, or something similar to that. But it's a very good way of keeping the information clean for our end users, because that part of the information isn't necessary for them. It's purely from a discussion standpoint. Chris has proposed an interesting question. So can a ticket remain unassigned by default, but then a support agent be able to assign the ticket only to themselves? So not necessarily. The first part, of course, is completely correct. So when the form is filled out, it will, by default, unless we set up some additional configurations, it will be default set to not assigned. However, if a user picks that up, if there's more than one person with the handle tickets permission based on those project roles, they won't necessarily be able to only assign it to themselves. When we look at the workflow section, we'll be able to see how we can limit who it can be assigned to at certain stages, maybe of the workflow. But there's no way to have that, like the system doesn't have that level of intelligence to identify who the person looking at the ticket is now and only allow them to select themselves, for instance. They would always have a selection of at least a couple of people, but there are a way to restrict that. So for instance, based on these permissions, where we would say that the handle ticket, let's say there was like 500 people in this project role as an example, a bit too many probably, but you will be able to limit how many could be selected at one point based on it being in a certain status or something like that, but you can't do it purely only for that individual, I'm afraid, Chris. Sorry, but moving back to the private notes here, as I mentioned, this will be a very useful tool, or can be a very useful tool. I would suggest strongly, if you plan to use the private notes, you always follow up with this option as well, which will mean that if you have the private notes permission, every time you come to the notes section, this will automatically be ticked and it will automatically be considered a private note. Because of course what you can do is just unclick that to make it a public note, and then everyone can see it again. But the reason I suggest that is it's much easier to accidentally have sent a private note that was supposed to be public than a public note that was supposed to be private, because you know that could potentially cause a bit of an issue. So bear that in mind, that if you do plan to utilize this feature, I would always recommend using the default notes option as well. Okay. So those are our permissions in place. We've created our project roles. We've given each of those project roles certain permissions. And what that will mean is if we now go to, again, the Infocapture list, if we scroll down here, we'll see that the help desk training form exists, okay? And this is now going to allow us to submit a ticket, as mentioned, based on the permissions we have. We can see that my name, or my profile name, at least on here, has been populated. It's taken the email address from my profile as well. We have our departments. Now, bear in mind, of course, the functionality to automatically set up that manager we haven't put that feature in there. Likewise, please describe will show up, and so will this second file upload, until we start looking at that advanced rule configuration. But for the meantime, hopefully we can see how some of these features work. Select that, put that in there, perfect, and then hit submit. Okay, so now of course I can see that this form has been submitted. We can see there's the assign to function, and I can assign it to any of these users. And that's fine. We've now submitted that. That's great. We'll also notice that because it is in that testing state, as it says up here, if we had any notifications set up, something again we'll look at in a later session, they wouldn't be sent at this time, because the testing state, although it's supposed to allow you to interact with the form on the front end, is purely to make sure all of the parts are working and running correctly. But there we go. Now, an important thing you might notice here is, of course, that we have this assigned to field, but the part that doesn't show up on here is the status, allowing us to move it to another stage within the workflow, as I mentioned, which is the next part of today's session, which I want to cover. Okay, so if we now go back to the admin side, we can see, of course, our workflow is down here, and that's where we will configure and set up all of those items. But before we even do that, we can see there's this tab up here, which is our statuses. Okay, so in order to be able to utilize the workflow or any of that functionality to say where it's going to go, we need to make sure that we have statuses enabled. So as we'll see, if we go into this section, the first thing that we'll be presented with is this checkbox to enable statuses for this project. If I click that, it's now going to automatically generate 3 statuses by default for me. We can see we have a new, in progress, and closed. And in turn with that, if we hit refresh here, we'll see, of course, that this status option appears. We're currently in the, well, it's currently not set. Normally it would automatically go to new, but this was created before the statuses. But we can see that we can move it to new, in progress, and closed. And rather importantly, you might see that even though we're in new, or we could be in new, let's go to there right now, in fact, we can see that we can immediately go straight to closed. Okay, and this is further sort of identified or highlighted is if we were to create a couple of new statuses, as we can see here. So let's say, let's create a new status, call it, more info required. Okay, let's put it something like this. There we go. So there's a new status. It's also worth mentioning that you can drag and drop these into different positions based on where they might need to go. And then we just need to hit save, sorry, there we go. Now with that, if we again hit refresh on the form on the front end, we'll see again that although we're enclosed, for instance, we can move still freely from status to status, okay? There isn't any sort of locked in configuration here to say that when it's in a certain status, it can only go to 1 of 2 or 2 of 3 or anything like that. There's no way to, at this moment in time, or there hasn't been in place any sort of restrictions for this. And that's of course where the workflow section goes in, or comes into play, should I say. So what I'm going to do is just create an additional status here as well. And we'll call this more info provided. Make this green color here, like so. And move that above, hit save. So we've committed that. Perfect. Okay, so these are potentially, you can of course have more than 5. You can have as many statuses as you want or as you will need for your sort of structure. But at this point, we'll see that we have 5. Now, the important part on top of this is with every status you create, it will generate what's called a field condition set. Okay, and this is something we'll go into in a bit more detail in our next session, but it's worth mentioning that field condition sets are sort of the backbone of any configuration or rule set within Claromentis, or within Infocapture and Claromentis, sorry. So without these, you can't have your workflow happen. You can't configure what's called field visibilities. You can't set up your service level agreements. And even then, it might limit certain triggers that you might want to generate and things along those lines. If we go into the field condition sets, you'll see that every time you create a new form, there will always be two hard-coded condition sets. One called default always and one called being reported, or default being reported, should I say. Now, default always, just simply, if you had to sum it up as a rule, would simply be, well, just that as the default, with no changes or no interaction whatsoever. This is the standard, and this is what this rule will state. Default being reported means that this is the standard only while you're filling out the form. And after that point, certain other things could happen or change. But underneath that, we can see for the statuses that we've created, the default statuses, the new, in progress, and closed, and of course the new statuses that I've created, the more info required and more info provided, the system will automatically create new condition sets for those as well. And what these condition sets are simply just saying is, if the status field option is in or equals this status, so if it equals new, then certain things can happen because of that. You can limit or you can open up more functionality as long as the status field equals that response, because of course there's a total of 5 responses. Each of those has a condition set tied to those, but meaning that each of those can then allow for different rules and configurations and things along those lines. It's a very huge factor of Infocapture as a whole. And as I said, we'll cover this in a bit more detail, creating brand new condition sets that aren't just tied to the statuses in a later section. But for now, let's just say, of course, that these condition sets, they're being relatively clear in what they're saying. And it just means that when the status equals one of these responses, a functionality can happen. And these, as I said, are very useful and very frequently tied in with the workflow function. Okay, so with those in place, we can now go to the workflow. And as I mentioned, of course, sorry, when we create a new status, I just want to hammer this home. Every time that we add a new status, it will automatically create a new condition set. So you don't even, when you're just working on the workflows, you don't necessarily need to look at the field condition sets at all. It will always generate these, and they will always be in place if you need them, as long as you choose to first off enable the statuses and then add new statuses. Trey, no, that's a good point, actually. I haven't reviewed the status groups just yet. And in fact, there are a bit more pieces of information with each of these statuses as well, which I probably should go over. So the first thing, of course, you can see that each of these has their title. It has a color to represent what they are. You can give a description for a bit more context of what this status means. And then you have the group name and archiving age. So these two are relatively important aspects. The status group ties nicely with a component that you can use. Excuse me, zoom's in the way. Let's have a look. Empty homepage, as you can see here. Yes, let's take a look. The open items work very nicely with a application or a component that can be added to your pages, funnily enough called open items here. And it will allow you to list particular tickets that are utilizing the open items section. But what that is sort of referring to is, as you can see down here, is we have these status groups. And as it says, status groups can be used to group multiple statuses together for dashboard pages components. For instance, the new and in progress can be part of the status group open tickets. So as it says here, and exactly as been already configured, the in progress and the new statuses are currently listed in a group called open. And this means basically any tickets that are not at sort of like a closed down state. You might have multiple closed down situations. For instance, this one only has closed, and that would potentially fall underneath this status group. But also you might have a form that has approvals required, and at certain points there could be rejections and the form can no longer go any further and things like that. That means that they could all go into this sort of status group function. But realistically, what these are tied to is purely the dashboard component here for stuff like the open items, where you can see this. You can specify particular all forms or specific forms if you want to, the information from there, and it will basically pull through and represent any tickets from either specific forms or all of them that are residing in the open items status group, okay? And of course, to add more in there if you wanted to, we can just simply hit edit. Let's say that the more info provided might also reside in there. And then, because we're obviously not necessarily, it isn't in our responsibility this time. So let's say when more info is required and closed, sit in the closed group here, meaning that those, any forms of that status won't appear in this open items component, where the ones that are either in new, in progress, and more info provided will appear in there. Oh, let's have a look, sorry. I see. So when you're saying, of course, not applicable, it just simply means that it doesn't really fall into that sort of category or functionality for any of the open items dashboard components or anything. It doesn't have any other play other than the fact that you can use this, as I said, for those components for your pages on the intranet. Yes. No, it doesn't show up on the dashboard. That's basically what it's specifying there. It's simply just an item that will not show up. In progress is the one that's considered open and will show up on the dashboard. Closed is just something that can be identified and recognized in that way. And not applicable just simply means that the status doesn't fall into one of those open or closed cases realistically. So you could technically argue that the more info required would technically fall under more applicable, not applicable, sorry, than it would fall under completed, for instance. It doesn't necessarily fall into those two remits. It won't show up in the open items components. But yeah, it's just sort of restricts them from any of those other dashboard features, really. Does that make sense there, Michelle? No worries, perfect. So yeah, so that's how the status groups work. Another feature, of course, as mentioned on here, is the option here to archive old tickets. And it simply means that based on the statuses that you've created, usually you would only implement these for, again, sort of closed cases. But when it's like in a closed state, you can automatically archive a particular, a submission, should I say, after say like 10 days. It would still give potentially the user an opportunity to reopen them if necessary, if you wanted to have that sort of setup. And of course, it just means that they won't appear in the standard sort of structure list here, tidying up everything. Because of course, if you don't apply archiving old tickets, every ticket will remain in the standard ticket list view and it will end up getting very busy. Whereas things that people don't need to sort of address anymore or look at, you can put them in the archive. They can still be brought up and found if necessary, but as a standard, they won't show up in the ticket list there. Michelle, sorry, you followed up with another thing there, which was, I would want to make sure that those need more info statuses would be counted in progress tickets on the dashboard. Yeah, I can totally see why it would be useful to have it there. The way that you could look at it though is, of course, when it's in that status, the person isn't responsible and might not necessarily need to look at it. And then once the end user has filled out that information, they would move it into more info provided, which would then, of course, appear in the sort of open items list. So the person knows that it's been responded to and they could fill that out. But you're totally right. There's no reason why more info required wouldn't necessarily fall in there. It's really up to your sort of preference. Are archived tickets still searchable? They are indeed, Karen. So just to give a showcase there, if we look at I believe the support tickets again has archiving options on. But you'll see, for instance, so from this view, this is the standard ticket list. And as mentioned, ideally, you would potentially want these to be archived over a period of time. Otherwise, it will just commit to a quite bloated list. But if you did want to search for old archives tickets, there's this option up here, which will take us to a search field functionality, where you can see it's the same ticket list, but this advanced search option opens up. And with the advanced search, it doesn't have to archived enabled, but basically what you'll see is there'll be an additional checkbox down below here, which will say include archived tickets. As soon as you click that and define all the other search functionality, it will make sure that that any ticket that has been archived will be included into that search. So it's absolutely fine. The archiving state is really just there to, as I said, you know, if you're getting a lot of tickets, this, as I said, could fill up quite a lot, end up looking quite busy. So it can just help clean things out, but you will always still be able to search for those as necessary. Great stuff. Okay. So yeah, so these are the statuses and how you can configure those as necessary. And as mentioned, of course, every status you create will define a field condition set, which can then be utilized for the workflow. So the workflow section here, as I said, is predominantly used to define when a form can go into particular statuses at certain times. But as it shows here, you can utilize this workflow function for different fields that have selectable values, if you will. So what we'll see, for instance, in this example, is if I go to the select field section, it will allow me to create a workflow revolving around the status, which is predominantly what you'll do it for. The assigned to field, allowing you to restrict when certain users can be assigned to look at the form, but also because these are also drop downs and they have certain defined selectable outcomes for them, the type of issue, the manager and department, you could also create something around those. For these particular options, it wouldn't make sense, but maybe for a form that you're creating, you have a drop down at different points. You only want it, like if it's in like an in progress status, you only want 3 of the options to be selected. You can certainly restrict that and do things along those lines. But most importantly, you'll be building this around, or most specifically, you'll be building this around the statuses and the assigned to. So with that mentioned, I'm going to select status here. I'm going to add a rule for this field, and it's going to bring up this additional pop-up. Okay, and it's basically going to ask me a series of options here to define this rule. Okay, so the first thing it's going to say is what condition set or what field condition set out of the ones we have do we want to utilize to limit certain things or to enable this rule setup going forward. So the first thing we would say, for instance, is using the conditions for each of those statuses, we would say when the status is in new, so the first status here, we want to say that only, you can select more than one if you want to, but we'd say potentially that the admin role can only move it to either more info required or in progress. Okay, so it's not allowing if we specify this. And again, as mentioned, you can also then select support desk at this point and say, likewise, they can only move it to more info required and in progress, like so. With that done, if I now hit add change rule, okay, that functionality has now been put in place. So we can see that we're saying that when it's in the status new, only the admin and the support desk members can move it, and they can only move it to more info required or in progress. They can't move it to anyone else, and none of these other project roles, even if they have the update ticket permission, as we saw in the project permission section, they won't be able to adjust it or configure it. Only these two, as they have been given defined specific logic, can move it, and of course they can only move it to those rules that have been stated. So again, to showcase that, if we go to our form in question, look at this one, we can see that it's currently in the closed status, so I can move it wherever I want. But if I went to new, which fulfills that condition set, because of course when the status equals new, we can only move it to more info required or in progress. Now, if I was to again move it to one of those ones, because we haven't set a rule for any of the other statuses, we'll see that it goes back to being a free-for-all basically, and I can select whichever I want. So what we need to do is, of course, using those condition sets, create a rule for each status to define where it can and cannot go, and out of the groups of users who can actually move it. So if we go back to here, we now want to, as we can see, there's this add rule button, so we can continue adding rules about this status section, and that's what we're going to do. So the next one, we're going to say that when it is in the more info required, let's say, status, then the submitter, should we say, the submitter can move it to more info required. More info provided, sorry, not more info required, being silly. Okay, and then that means that they're able to update it and move it to the appropriate status. So that means that they would have potentially filled it out, they would have filled out their information, and they are the ones then responsible for moving it. The support team in this case and the admin can't. Maybe you would like to give them the options, because otherwise you're solely relying on the submitter of the ticket to actually update that, whereas sometimes they might just provide the information and forget to update the status. So you can, of course, go back into this, re-edit it, and say, maybe the admin has the opportunity to also put it into more info provided if necessary. Okay, and that means, of course, we can make those changes as necessary. Again, the other project roles at this point, even if they had the permission to update statuses, they wouldn't be able to, because there is an additional restriction and logic tied to this. So now what we'll say is we'll add another rule. We'll say that when it's the more info provided, the admin can again go to more info required or in progress, and so can the support desk. So done. So potentially what we could see is this constant loop of going back and forth, submitting information still not being enough, and the submitter having to keep on moving it back to that status. However, let's say we're finally happy with that and it has moved to in progress. We would then create for this status, when it's in progress, the admin can move it to closed, and so can the support team, because of course have done their fixing, they've resolved everything there. Add change rule. Perfect. And there we go. So basically we can see we've come to using these condition sets. We've come to the end of our workflow. We've got to a point where we will be selecting the closed status. But it's also worth mentioning that, of course, when we get to closed, there is no defining logic around that. So what will happen is when we get to closed, we can jump anywhere again. So what we always have to remember is we need to put one final rule in here for the closed status, like so. And it can be for any of the project roles. It doesn't necessarily matter, but we'll say status equals closed. Let's just say admin, and they can only move it to closed, like so. Okay, you need this final rule in this structure just to stick it there. Like it might be a case that you would also create a status called reopen, for instance. And at that point, you might say that when it's enclosed, it could go to reopen or something similar to that. That's absolutely fine. But for the purpose of this sort of structure, we're just going to say once it's closed, it's closed. If you have missed something or there's another thing that you need, you'll have to submit another ticket to go through that process. But again, what we will have done now and what we've achieved is to go through that entire sort of process. We have now restricted everything based on those rules. I'm actually going to go back to new very quickly. Hopefully we can do that even though those rules are in place. No, yeah, see, you can see I can't actually do that. That's fine. So let's create a new one. Let's just say marketing. There we go, submit. And of course, because it's the first status, it will automatically go to new. And then of course, based on those condition sets and based on that workflow logic that we've created, we can see that when it's in new, we can only move it to one of these ones. Let's go to more info required. When it's in more info required, it can only be moved back to more info provided by either the submitter, which is me, or also an admin, which is technically also me, but that's fine. And then I can go like so. When it's in more info provided, again, I can go back to more info required if it still wasn't enough, or I can go to in progress. Now it's in progress. We can see, of course, that we can only move it to closed. We'll hit that. And of course, because of that final rule that we've put in place, we'll see that now it's enclosed, it's locked in there, and we can't change it going from that point onwards. In what way there, Trey? So Trey's asked a question very quickly. Is there a way in which you could use the default always field condition if there wasn't a need for a more specific workflow? So if it was going to be a bit more open-ended and you could just say at any point, basically. So the default always would simply mean that at any point within the sort of process, you could move it to the defined statuses. So if we said like default always, you could say that the admin could move it to like all of these, for instance. And you could set that up in a way that it means that only the administrators could do that and none of the other project roles could. But you can also achieve that with the permission just in the project permissions overall by saying that they're the only ones who can move the status along. I mean, you certainly could utilize that, but because the system already does that, like if you don't put any rules in there, it will automatically just consider it. You can move it anywhere. So if you didn't need a specific workflow, I'd maybe just leave this blank. But yeah, I mean, is there a specific circumstance or idea that you're thinking of at all? Okay, perfect. Yes, that's indeed what it'll do. So if you just leave this part completely empty, you'll just have that sort of free reign and control there, Trey. But, you know, it's a good question to ask. But perfect. Okay, so I think, again, for the time being, that's the end of our session here. Just to clarify, of course, just very quickly, as mentioned, you can also utilize this for other drop-downs or fields with values in your form, including the assign to, where you might find use for this, where you could potentially say that when it's in like the in progress status, maybe the admin or maybe both because they can update it, but you can say that only out of this, only a group of users can be specified. So we can say that while it's here, out of the full potential of users that can actually be selected, I've already forgotten who it was, maybe like so, only out of everyone there, only those two can be selected, for instance. So there is certainly a use for that. But yes, again, if you don't specify this functionality, if you don't have this logic tray, it will automatically just allow you to assign it to all of those users. And you can select at any point by default, as long as, again, you have, if we look at the project permissions, as long as a role that you're part of has this assigned tickets permission, that option will be available and you can select anyone at any point. It's only if you need to be specific would you use the workflow for that, to lock it down to certain users to say, at this point, based on the status it's in or anything like that, do we only want to restrict it to these 3 or 4 users, for instance? Otherwise, you will, by default, just have free control of assigning it to whoever you want. Okay. Right, so again, as per usual with Infocapture, I have a tendency to waffle on, so apologies for going over the hour mark once more, everyone. I appreciate people who managed to stay. As mentioned, this has been recorded, so we will add it to knowledge base if anyone needs to go over anything again. But hopefully, again, this has given an understanding of how the permissions work, how it will allow you to interact with any Infocapture forms, as well as the workflow side of that, allowing you to be very specific with how the form can move along and define where it can go in terms of the statuses you've created. So yes, thank you very much for your time, everyone. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day, and I will speak to you next month for our next part of Infocapture. Okay, take care now. Bye.